let's get started. So let's get questions about the midterm off of our chest. First, before we get going, midterm coming up on next Thursday. So everything that we cover today, up until the end of today, will be on the midterm. So you know when to cut the material. You'll write it in class, so you get the full 80 minutes. What else can I tell you? There'll be 3 questions. This is very similar to the format in Human Phys 1. 3 questions. They'll be worth 10 marks each, so you're used to all that. There'll be choice. So I think there'll probably be 6 questions. You'll answer 3, but the choice will be, here's 2, answer 1, here's 2, answer 1, here's 2, answer 1. Okay, so that gives you the ability to put your best foot forward. If something shows up that you didn't have completely polished before you came in, then it gives you a chance to focus in on something else. You can answer these questions in any way that you like in terms of how you communicate. Okay, it doesn't have to be in fancy written form. It doesn't have to rhyme. It doesn't have to be pretty prose. It can just be pictures, and you can talk to me the same way that I've been talking to you. Okay, diagrams, short forms, all kinds of stuff, fair game. If you're going to make up your own short form, you got to let a gal know what that stuff means. Okay, but if you're using short form that we've used in class, then we will totally get what you're aiming for. Okay. Is there any other questions about? Yeah. Do I do the +1 mark? Indeed, we do that. Yes. So we will talk about that after you get the tests back, once they're graded. But yes, that same scheme happens. Humans mark these so humans can have an error, and I've been tracking the error for 8 to 10 years, and the error could be or minus half a grade in 5% of the tests. So it's a small error, but the error is there. And so what we'll do is we will just overcompensate for that. Everyone will get an extra grade in hopes that you weren't to make up for that potential 5%. But if things need to be regraded, then we need to give you an accurate grade if it comes back for regrading, so that mark goes away and then we start regrading. Okay, but we'll discuss that again at the regrading stage. Okay? Any other types of questions? So you've been working on questions that have come from old midterms in the problem-solving sessions already, so you know what they're going to look like. That's where they've been being pulled from. So for instance, midterm 1 last year had all of the questions, or had the types of questions that we were thinking about when it came to SNS effects on nodal cells and parasympathetic effects on nodal cells. Okay, so these are it's the exact same questions you've been working on. Okay, the only difference here then is we jumped right into the problem-solving type questions because you had your notes in front of you. So I could say, find the nodal cell in your books, and now we're going to jump right to here because you've got your notes in front of you. Okay, so the only difference on these types of questions is you won't have your notes in front of you, so you will be asked to put that information down. Okay, so there's detail there that you need to know, and I think that it's only fair, because if I jump to this question on a midterm, I will expect you to have known all this. So it's only fair that I asked you to put it down so you get credit for what you know, and then we jump off of doing some problem solving off of that. So classic style is to get you to put a piece of information down, and then we jump off that in terms of problem solving, okay? But it's important that this be put down because you will have to have known that for the problem solving pieces. So I don't think it's fair to ask you to know all this and not give you credit for knowing all that. Okay, so that's what that piece is for. All right, so that's where the questions will differ a little bit from what you've been doing in the problem-solving sessions already. Okay? The grades, as in the problem-solving sessions, the approximate grades, a grade allocation will be there, and now you know that we give half grades for some ideas and full grades for bigger ideas. Okay, but indeed it does say approximate, right? So I will give you what I think it's going to be worth to give you a guide, because I know you all like that, but you have to let me have some wiggle room in case, let's say I set up a marking scheme where I think I should expect these 8 ideas, and I'm only ever getting 7. That means that something didn't come across in class like I thought it should, and you have to be, and I don't want to stick to that marking scheme because that will penalize you. So you have to let me wiggle a little bit. So usually I will be within a mark of what this says. So I'm not ever going to say it's approximately 4, but surprise, it was 8. That's never going to happen, okay? If it says approximately 4, it might shift to 3.5 if something was constantly not there. Or if you all were giving me something that I didn't expect, then I have to be able to reward that as well, okay? So there's a little wiggle room, but that's why it does say approximately, because we have to allow for how things came across in class. Seem reasonable? Any questions? There is office hours next week on Tuesday, the normal time. If you can't make it, then send me an email and I can try to find you some time outside that, or the TAs are available, so there's lots of places to get questions answered or help, okay? We good? Anything bugging anybody in particular? Besides that you're having a midterm in the first place, I guess. Okay, cool. So let us jump from where we were. We were goofing around with capillary fluid flux, going through some examples. So also note that this course is a fair problem-solving, critical thinking type of course. Okay, so when we run up against something where I give you a tool, and then we spend 3/4 of an hour messing with that tool, it's probably a pretty good tool to be thinking about knowing for a midterm. Okay, so you have got to know capillary fluid flux is coming. Okay, so test yourself, do that with different scenarios, argue with your friends. Critical thing though is that you tell every step. Okay, so in this class, I have never jumped from increased mean arterial pressure, therefore increased capillary pressure. Okay, I've never done that because you won't get it. So you can't give that back to me. That's not the way I talk to you, so you can't talk to me that way. We go through every step. There are marks that reside there. If you don't want those marks, don't tell me those steps, but there are marks that reside there for telling me how you got from A to B. Okay, there are marks there. I'm telling you that right now. There are marks there for saying increase volume into, increase volume in, increase pressure in. There are marks there. If you're not going to tell me that, I can't give you the grades for that. Okay, so tell me what you're thinking along the way. And again, this is where physiology gets like math. If you tell me what you're thinking, and I see, and it's wrong, and I see where you went wrong, then we will dock a mark for where it went wrong, but continue to mark based on that error. Okay? In a math course, you would never have a question and they say, what's the answer? You would say 12. That would never happen. You would work your way through how you got to 12, right? And part marks are always available. If you're just going to jump to 12, there are no part marks available. And if it's wrong, it's wrong. So I implore you to talk to me the way that I've been talking to you, because marks reside there. Okay? So, buff up on capillary fluid flux. Note to self. Okay, we have one more compartment to think about before we put this whole mess together. Veins. Not going to spend a lot of time here. Doesn't mean they're not critical. There's just really one or two functionally important things to talk about, and then we're off to put the whole system together. Okay, so veins were our storage compartment. We saw that they were a high volume, really low pressure compartment. we're talking about 3.5 liters residing in that compartment with a pressure of 7 millimeters of mercury. Okay, so a very elastic wall, very particularly built compartment in order to be able to manage or produce super low pressures with higher volumes. And essentially, what this means then is this is the volume right before the right heart. Okay, so we are now back to end diastolic volume. Okay, so you remember when we talked about end diastolic volume in the very beginning, about how we're going to change cardiac output, and I said we have to leave that there for a minute because we have to get blood flowing back to the heart before we can talk about end diastolic volume. Okay, so that's where we're going to be thinking about today, because we're talking about blood returning to the heart. Venous return we'll talk about. But the cool thing is the very small pressure gradient that we are going to return blood to the heart by. Okay, so if we think about our pressure on the arterial side, just as a reminder, all right, that was mean arterial pressure. So that was our highest pressure. We built a pump to be able to put volume out into a very specialized tube, which was a low volume, high pressure system. So that combination built set this very high pressure on the arterial side at the beginning. We talked about pressure in the capillary being approximately 20 millimeters of mercury. Right, so our delta P for flow, or our drive for flow in terms of tissue delivery, is the difference between the two. Okay, so the 80 millimeters of mercury is what we're using to deliver blood from the heart to the tissues, right? So if we're thinking about tissue delivery pressure, then we're using 80 millimeters of mercury to do that. So 80 millimeters of mercury to drive flow from the heart out into the tissues. Okay, but then we did talk about pressure. We have to have a pressure drop as we go across the entire system. Pressure in the veins was we called it mean circulatory filling pressure. We said that was around 7 millimeters of mercury. Okay, and then right atrial pressure, we talked about being approximately 0 millimeters of mercury. So our pressure, our delta for our pressure, our difference in pressure to get blood from the veins back to the heart is a 7 millimeter of mercury change. So 80 millimeters of mercury to drive it out there. 7 millimeters of mercury is the pressure gradient. For delivery of blood back to the heart. So we are very vulnerable to changes in venous pressure. Venous pressure goes up or down a little bit, that's going to pretty dramatically change blood flow back to the heart. Okay, so we don't have to change it. We don't have to change venous pressure now by 20 millimeters of mercury to get a significant change in flow back to the heart. We can just change it by 1 or 2 millimeters of mercury and we can start to get a significant volume return or change in venous return. So essentially, this helps us a little see how this compartment has to behave, or how this compartment has to be built if I need flow from the venous side back to the right atria. Right, my P1 is going to be mean circulatory filling pressure. My P2 is going to be right atrial pressure. And then the and flow will be inversely proportional to resistance in the veins. All right, because the numerator is so low, 7 millimeters of mercury pressure drop, for delivery of volume, resistance has to be wicked low, okay? We cannot do anything to create resistance in this system on the venous side. If we do something to create resistance here, our venous return will drop, and then you can't pump what you don't have, okay? So we have to be very careful on this side to keep resistance in the veins incredibly low, okay? So that's the scenario that we're living in. So we do, because of this low pressure gradient, we do have help in getting flow back to the heart. Okay, and one of the ways to help get blood flow back to the heart is one-way valve. So we are going to see the same approach to a low pressure problem like we did in the lymphatics. Lymphatics has this huge low pressure problem, so we build in these one-way valves, and now as long as we can get pressure above a valve. It's the creepiest door ever this morning. Are people hearing funny noises out of that door? Okay, good. It's not just me. I'm not having a stroke. I feel like I'm okay, but it's creeping me out. So anyways, we're going to have these one-way valves, right, so that if I can get volume above the one-way valve, that volume can't flow back, because if it flows back, we snap the valve shut, okay? So we have the same type of one-way valves sitting in the venous system, okay, built in a way that we can get flow in one direction, but if flow comes back, we snap the valve shut, flow stops, okay? So now venous return is about getting volume just above the next valve, okay? We add to that where a lot of these, or the tissue in which a lot of these veins lie, okay? A lot of these veins will lie in, let's say, skeletal muscles. The veins lie obviously in every tissue, but in particular in skeletal muscle, where we create a lot of intravascular pressure every time you contract and you increase tissue pressure, you're increasing your, quote, environmental pressure, increasing your transmural pressure, right? You are then squeezing this, compressing this blood vessel, dropping its radius, pushing blood up to the next valve compartment, okay? So tissue pressure, they call it the skeletal muscle pump, okay? So this is like this is like a pump at the level of the tissue, right? When you begin to contract it, you will actually increase blood back to the heart, okay? Very practical uses to this. If anyone has ever seen, I've only ever seen on TV, the changing of the guards at Buckingham Palace. You ever seen those poor souls outside in the middle of summer in these incredibly hot black hats, furry things? I'm not sure what the point of that is. And then their wool. They're standing there wearing wool, and then they have to stand out still, completely still, for hours. Okay, so every time in the summer you see one of those poor souls drop. There's even a whole ceremony for how you go out and get the poor soul on some gurney and take them off and replace them with another poor soul. Okay, so the person that dropped is usually the rookie. It's usually their first year, and what they're not doing is using their muscle pump. All of the other veterans are standing there, but they're not standing still. They're contracting their leg muscles the entire time they're standing there. Okay? Because what's happening in the folks that are not contracting their muscles is they're getting very hot. Everything is vasodilating. Because they're standing, blood is being pulled into their legs. Eventually they're going to, because blood is pooling down here, you're not getting venous return, you're not getting cardiac output, you're not getting blood flow to the brain, so they pass out. The other folks are standing there continually contracting their muscles in succession so that they are essentially pumping blood. Their blood's pooling too, but they're pumping blood back to the heart using their legs, okay? And all that is creating intramuscular pressure, transmural pressure, compressing the veins, dropping their diameter, and then blood can only flow in one direction because of the valves. Okay? One-way valves, skeletal muscle pump, and the third thing, we do have SNS innervation into the veins. Okay, so this you might think is, oh, that's great, I'll just vasoconstrict those veins and life is good. That is super bad. We cannot vasoconstrict this venous compartment because we will increase resistance, drop flow, and you're out like that poor soul on a hot, sunny afternoon. Okay? So the maneuver regarding venoconstriction. So when we talked about vasoconstriction, okay, let's be clear on these terms. We talked about vasoconstriction. We were always talking about this. We were talking about arterioles. So we were talking about constriction of a very specific point between arteries and capillaries, right? We never cared about what's in that compartment. We never said, oh, I wonder what the pressure in the arterioles is. We never cared. We just used it as a resistor. Constrict it, dilate it, flow goes through or flow doesn't, okay? On the venous side, we're actually going to, the entire venous side is innervated. And when you increase SNS out to the smooth muscle on the venous side, you don't actually drop its diameter. Okay, dropping its diameter, again, would be catastrophic. You change resistance, you wouldn't get flow back to the heart. What it does is it stiffens the wall. Okay, so this maneuver doesn't drop diameter, it stiffens the wall. It changes the nature of the container. It was a very elastic container before this maneuver, now it's slightly more rigid. Okay, you change the rigidity of that container, you're going to change its pressure-volume relationship. Okay, so this maneuver is a little bit different. At the end of the day, there's very little effect on resistance because we can't have that. So we can't be built that way. We won't work. But it changes the compliance of the vessel wall. Okay, we're going to change its elasticity. So venoconstriction will decrease. Elasticity is a word people tend to understand a bit more. We will drop the elastic nature of this. So it's like when you blow up one of those balloons that you can't blow up. I don't know why they make balloons that way. You know those balloons where you blow and blow, and like they're super hard, you gotta pull them and do all these maneuvers just to try to get a little bit of air in and your cheeks hurt, right? Though that is an incredibly unelastic compartment versus the balloons where you can just blow in and bam, the thing blows up. Lots of elasticity, okay? So venoconstriction is akin to changing it from that really easy balloon to blow up to that hard balloon to blow up. Okay, we change the nature of the wall, right? So essentially what that does is change the pressure-volume relationship. Of the entire compartment. So we're not just going to do some sort of spot control like we did with arterioles. We're going to change the nature of the whole compartment, and we will work on what that means in a minute, okay? Essentially, though, when we're talking about veins and what we're bringing back to the heart, we are talking about venous return. Okay, so these things are going to affect venous return. So just the definition, this is the volume of blood returning to the heart per minute. And so if we think about venous return, which is just the amount of blood returning back per minute, that's a flow measure. All right, it's just this equation, it's this relationship, right? So venous return is going to be equal to whatever mean circulatory filling pressure is, and right atrial pressure. And it's going to be inversely proportional to resistance in the veins. Okay, this venous return is preload. Remember that word? This is what preload is. What we return to the heart is going to be what preload is. It's going to be end diastolic volume. Okay, so we've kind of come back full circle. And of course, we know that what you return to the heart totally dictates what you put out. Okay, if you're going to return less, you're going to put less out. We talked about the Frank-Starling effect. We talked about all kinds of reasons why that would be true. Okay, so essentially venous return is going to equal or dictate cardiac output. Okay? So when we go back to our big picture of what affected cardiac output, there was an end diastolic volume and end systolic term in that equation. We have now landed back onto what is going to be affecting end diastolic volume. Okay, so anytime we mess with venous return, we're going to be messing with end diastolic volume and therefore cardiac output of the heart. Okay, but we'll connect that. Okay, let's try to start that connecting. So we're going to play with a computer program that unfortunately has come and gone, but I have the data from it still, where we're going to think a little bit about, now on the very first day I said, on a good day, the cardiovascular system is a closed system, and I said we're going to hold that thought until we put the whole system together. Right, so now we're actually going to start to see the ramifications of what I meant when I said it was a closed system. And that is, when you affect one area of the cardiovascular system, you are going to affect another. All right, if it was an open system, it'd be a bad day, but easier to figure out. Okay, it's a closed system though, so it's a good day, so we have to take some time to figure out cause and effect here. All right, so this is just a little preamble to the cardiovascular system, or the cardiovascular mechanics program. Really critical here. We've got, where is it? Vascular resistance and conductance are not influenced by pressure. So what does that mean? This means that this thing is not auto-regulating. Okay, so this we're not going to bring the myogenic response into any arguments that we talk about here. And then it says this model does not consider neural or hormonal compensation. So we are not compensating yet. We're just going to look at this. We use this model to see how the body's going to get messed up. We have to plug sensors in first before we know how the body's going to fix it. We're not there yet, right? We're going to use this model to look at how does the system get messed up. Okay? So no regulation yet. So that's really all that's critical in that preamble. We have pressure in millimeters of mercury, volume in, looks like liters. Yeah, volumes in liters, pressures in millimeter mercury. Okay, that's all we really need to know to play with this model. So I've run the model in a couple of different ways, and I've brought the data here to you for us to talk about. Okay. So we're going to model the cardiovascular system kind of like that 4-box system that we played a little bit with on Tuesday, where we have the left heart feeding the systemic system, and then returning back to the right heart, which feeds the pulmonary system, and so on. Okay, so we're going to model the whole cardiovascular system in these scenarios, just with this simple model. We've got pressures here, right? So P's are pressure in millimeters of mercury. And we have volumes in liters. And then we have the different compartments that we've known that after the left ventricle, we get ourselves into systemic. arteries. Okay, we talked about resistance. When we threw resistance into the system, or those arterioles, we talked about it kind of right there, that spot resistance. We've got our capillary beds. I've got one of them represented, but you know we have over 600 of them down here, okay, in parallel with each other. Then we move into systemic veins. Back to the right heart, and then the right heart pumps into pulmonary, oops, I don't know what that word is. Pulmonary arteries. Across the one capillary bed, so this is our lung. That's our lung capillary bed. Okay, so that is one capillary bed up here, and then into our pulmonary veins. And then back to the left ventricle. Okay, so just to kind of orient you, this is really the picture we put up on almost day one when we started thinking about the cardiovascular system, okay? So we're just mimicking that. And indeed, this computer model is simulating as best it can human numbers. Okay, so in the first example, just to get some points across about this system that we need to get across, I've stopped the heart. Okay, so I've lowered the heart to zero as best as I could. So our cardiac output is 0. You can't actually do that in this simulation. You can get it really, really, really low. So the numbers aren't exactly as what we would expect if you could shut the heart off, but they're really, really close. They're good enough for us to work with. And then I had jacked up the volume to 6.5 liters, so this is a little bit more volume than we have in the system, and then I took 2 liters out. Right, just to show you that when you stop the heart, first of all, where does blood settle, right? Where does blood, how much volume settles in each compartment, because that tells us a little bit about the nature of that compartment, right? So you stop the heart, and you find that you have in the systemic arteries 50 mils, 50 mils of volume will settle in the aortic and artery compartment, resulting in 13 millimeters of mercury pressure. Okay, as compared to the systemic vein side, where just naturally 4.7 liters of volume resides there, exerting a pressure of 7 millimeters of mercury. That's our classic mean circulatory filling pressure. Okay, so really critical that you see here, I was not lying. Veins are a high volume, low pressure system. Okay, so really critical. Veins are a high volume, low pressure system. Okay, 4.7 liters, oh my gosh, 4.7 liters. That's like 6 bottles of wine, right? Standard bottle of wine. 6 bottles of wine on one side, 7 millimeters of mercury. Okay? Compared to the systemic arteries, 50 mils. I don't even know if that's a glass of wine. That's not my glass of wine. Less than my glass of wine, and 13 millimeters of mercury pressure. Incredibly low volume, incredibly high pressure. Okay, do you see it? I was not lying. Low volume, high pressure, real critical. This is telling us really staggering things about the nature of these vessel walls. Okay. Similarly, pulmonary arteries, low volume, high pressure. So it's an arterial, an artery side, so it still has that transport, that wall designed for transport. So on the pulmonary artery side, low volume, high pressure. Pulmonary vein side, that's where pretty much the rest of the volume resides. 1.8 liters up in your pulmonary veins, creating 6 millimeters of mercury pressure, okay? So in both compartments, veins are high volume, low pressure. Arteries are high pressure, low volume, okay? And then, so that's really all I want to get across here. When I took volume out, took 2 liters out, magic. And you can see that in every compartment, volume dropped and pressure dropped. So if you're in a scenario where you're losing blood volume isn't necessarily just coming specifically out of one compartment. Everything is connected. If you get a drop in every compartment in volume, you will get a drop in pressure. Mind you, some compartments we will lose more volume, for sure, because there was more volume there to begin with. But in every compartment, you will indeed have this pressure-volume relationship, okay? So, I need you to carry that forward. Veins, high volume, low pressure. Arteries, low volume, high pressure, okay? And in terms of where this course is heading, it's this pressure here we care about, right? That's mean arterial pressure. That's what we're going to be holding constant. That's what we're going to sense. And that's what's going to change the body's behavior. Not in this model, but again, in terms of keeping our eye on the prize, this is really the compartment that we're going to be trying to figure out what's happening in. Okay? So, what else did I do with the model? I've still got the heart off as best I can. Volume is back to normal, so we got 5.5 liters of volume sitting in there now, and we see those pressure volume, I dropped a 1.5, that should be up there. We see our pressure volume relationships, and I turn around and I change the systemic arterial compliance. I drop it. So I drop the elasticity of the systemic arterial compartment, okay? So the heart is off, okay? How does the system change when I go ahead and I make the systemic arteries a more rigid tube? I change their pressure-volume relationship. That's what changing elasticity did. Okay, I change the pressure-volume relationship. So the challenge was here, and I actually made it less elastic, so I made it more rigid, right? So now less volume is going to equal more pressure. All right, I changed its pressure-volume relationship. So if I have a decreased volume, and I should see an increase in pressure. And in fact, in this compartment, I did drop volume. The pressure didn't go up, it stayed the same, but you can see how for less volume now, I have a high pressure. That was what I changed about the model. I changed the rigidity of this tube. So if you look around the system, you kind of go, meh, who cares? Nothing really changed. Not a whole lot of pressures or volumes changed anywhere in the system based on that maneuver. Okay? Essentially what I did was I displaced 40 mils. So 40 mils went from this compartment somewhere else, right? And in fact, you've got to ask the computer to go to one more decimal place to find the 40 mils. The 40 mils is over here. And because it's in the veins, and the veins are such a high volume, low pressure system, 40 mils went over into this compartment with really very little, with no change in pressure, right? Because it's such an elastic compartment. Okay, so the displaced 40 mils went here. Okay, so just so you know where we were arguing, the displaced 40 mils went there. The system didn't change very much, did it? Why? Because this was an incredibly rigid compartment to begin with, right? It was already low volume, high pressure, and we just said, all right, we're going to make it a little lower volume and a little higher pressure. No big deal. The system doesn't change. So it's not a big surprise that we haven't been talking about SNS innervation into the arteries and the aorta to constrict on that side, because that maneuver wouldn't do anything to the system. It does if we change it right here. We've seen that mayhem already. But we don't have a lot of control over the nature of the container on this side, because it doesn't matter. It's such a low volume system, whatever, doesn't matter, okay? Crazy though is the power on the venous side. All right, so I just talked about veins for like 20 minutes and we didn't really see a whole lot of excitement there except for what veins do when you put them back into the cardiovascular system and you mess with vasoconstriction. Okay, so let's take a look at changing venous compliance and what that might do. Okay, so if I go in and I change systemic venous compliance, so I'm going to decrease the elasticity on the systemic venous side. I'm going to change the pressure-volume relationship of the systemic veins. I'll just write that down and I'll get back to you. That's what that maneuver will do. Change the pressure-volume relationship of systemic veins. Yeah. So I think that there's a little bit of volume went up there, but I couldn't take it out to any more decimal places. So that would imply, I think, that 1 or 2 mils went up there. I just think that the model can't necessarily track to that level of, yeah. Okay. Drop the elasticity of the systemic veins. So here's the challenge. I'm going to make the systemic veins less compliant, so I should see a decrease in volume and an increase in pressure here. Okay, that's the challenge. I went in and we made the walls more rigid. We made it from that balloon that was easy to blow up to that balloon that's hard to blow up. Okay, so we should see a drop in volume with an increase in pressure. That was the challenge. All right, so I have less volume in there and the pressure's higher. That was me changing compliance. The issue with the venous side, though, when you mess with a storage container, is that you now displace 1.4 liters of volume into the rest of the system. So messing with venous compliance has massive power in what we call getting blood back from storage. That's what they're referring to. I just put 1.4 liters that was normally in the venous compartment and I displaced it somewhere else, okay? Because it's a closed system, the rest of the system has to handle that. So now the rest of the system has to handle 1.4 liters of volume. So it's going to be no big surprise that in every compartment we see an increase in volume and an increase in pressure as the rest of the system tries to manage what to do or tries to manage that 1.4 liters. So the bulk of it ended up in the pulmonary veins, our other storage compartment, right? So a liter of it went over there, and we more than doubled pressure. Small volumes went into the arterial side, so 40 mils went back into the systemic arteries, but we more than doubled pressure there, right? So you can see the power now that if I had a drop in mean arterial pressure as a problem, systemic venous vasoconstriction has massive power to help us raise that. Okay? Shows us right here. If I can take 1.4 liters, and make the rest of the body handle it. And a little bit of that volume makes it, which it will, over into the systemic arteries. I've got an increase in volume there and an increase in pressure there. Okay? So although we don't spend a lot of time messing or thinking about veins, they have huge power in controlling pressure and volumes elsewhere in the system. Okay? And again, that vasoconstriction is not a spot constriction like we talk about with arterioles. With arterioles, we talk about this one spot where we're going to introduce resistance in the system. We're talking about changing the pressure-volume relationship right there and not changing resistance. Can't change resistance or else you're going to decrease your venous return. Okay? Bad day. Super bad day. Okay, let's then watch the mayhem that ensues when we turn the heart on. Okay? But we got to bring that information forward with us. Okay, we got to think about those pressure-volume relationships, the differences between those two compartments, arteries and veins. So just before we take a break, I will just fix this up a little. I don't know why I dropped my numbers. Okay, so in this example, we're back to 5.5 liters of blood, so we got a normal blood volume. The right ventricle function is normal, so 1 is normal. And left ventricular function was decreased to 30%. Okay, so this is left heart failure. This is mimicking left heart failure. So the pump is not working. Okay, so in any of these situations, you look for the challenge. Where's the challenge in this system? The challenge is that pump. So number 1, the pump isn't working. Okay, what does the pump do? That pump moves volume from this compartment to this compartment. That's what that pump does. So the game afoot here is to try to predict the volumes and the pressures in each of our 4 major compartments. Okay? We're going to try to predict volume here and pressure here. Volume here, pressure here. Volume here, pressure here. Volume here, pressure here. Okay? That's what we're going to try to do. We're going to try to see how the cardiovascular system as a closed system handles that problem. We're not going to fix it, because remember, the system isn't regulating. We're just going to try to predict the problem, and then once we get the sensors plugged in, we will then see how the body fixes it. Okay? But now, first of all, we need to work on the problem. So let's take a quick break, and then we'll get back to trying to figure that out. All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's get back to our heart failure. It's definitely a bad day. So now what we're going to try to do, like I said, is we're going to change the system and then kind of take a look at what's going to happen, or try to predict what's going to happen in a snapshot at a period of time. Okay, we're not going to say this happens and then this happens and then this happens and then this happens and then this happens, because now you're talking about cause and effect and cause and effect and cause and effect. Okay, the system isn't regulating. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at what the problem was, and then in a snapshot, look at how that affected the system. Okay, so if I were to decrease cardiac output of the left heart, and the left heart is takes that volume and puts it into the systemic arteries, I should fully expect to see in the compartment that it's supposed to be filling a decrease in volume and a decrease in pressure. Okay, so we went from our normal heart function, it was about 5.5 liters of cardiac output, generated approximately a mean arterial pressure of approximately 100. So we're starting to see the numbers that we kind of normally expect to see in a system that's functioning. Mean circulatory filling pressure around 7. Then we decrease cardiac output of the left heart. So very easy to predict is the compartment next to it is what will happen, right? That's the one that's easiest to predict. And then of course it's easier to predict the compartment above the problem, right? If the heart was to be moving volume from pulmonary veins to systemic arteries and it's no longer emptying this compartment and it's no longer filling that compartment, we should see an increase in volume and an increase in pressure in the compartment above, and a decrease in volume and a decrease in pressure in compartment below. Okay? You see, those ones are pretty straightforward. It's normally easy to predict the compartments above and below the problem. Now, the difficulty in predicting, which is why we have the numbers with us today, the difficulty starts to get in terms of the farther you move from the problem. Okay? So when we look then about how now would this affect the systemic venous compartment and the pulmonary artery compartment. Okay? Pulmonary or the systemic veins, we're seeing a decrease in volume and a decrease in pressure. Because flow in the systemic system has now decreased. Okay? We have just experienced a drop in P1 when it comes to systemic flow. When we think about flow across the entire system, and we decrease our drive for flow, we've just decreased P1, then we would expect flow into the systemic veins to be less. Okay, so we could probably then predict we would have less volume in that compartment and less pressure in that compartment. Okay? Similar thinking, though, is our right heart. 1, 2, 3. Let's go back to thinking about this right heart. The right heart is okay. We're not in right heart failure here. The right heart is then continuing to move volume from this compartment to this one. Okay? We're not in right heart failure. So if we went to 1, 2, 3, we argued less cardiac output, less flow in the systemic system, so we have less volume in the systemic system and less pressure in the systemic system. Okay? So we have just lowered systemic venous pressure. Okay? We have just dropped mean circulatory filling pressure. Okay? That's what that is, right? Pressure of the veins. We have just decreased mean circulatory filling pressure. Now we've just talked about what that means for venous return or flow back to the right heart. Okay? Venous return was proportional to mean circulatory filling pressure minus right atrial pressure, which we haven't altered, and inversely proportional to resistance in the veins. Okay? We have just decreased mean circulatory filling pressure. So we have just dropped venous return. We have just decreased Venous return. Venous return is preload. Venous return is end diastolic volume. We drop end diastolic volume, we drop stroke volume, we drop cardiac output. Okay. So this is, we're continuing to think in this direction, so decrease venous return, so this is going to decrease end diastolic volume, decrease stroke volume, decrease cardiac output. So if I drop cardiac output of the right heart, I should fully expect the pulmonary arteries to show a drop in volume and a drop in pressure, correct? That logic is sound. I'll tell you that there is not an error in that thinking. Okay? So we should see a drop in volume and a drop in pressure. We don't. So that means there's something else affecting that compartment that we've not taken into account yet. Can you see what might be affecting that compartment that we haven't taken into account yet? Think about flow across the pulmonary system right now. Flow across that pulmonary system. Flow equals P1 minus P2 over R. What is affecting flow across the pulmonary system right now? You see it? So contracting skeletal muscle. Okay, so we are up in the pulmonary system right now. So no skeletal muscle here. Plus this poor soul is in left heart failure, so we've got them laid down. Let's argue that. Yeah. An increased pressure in the pulmonary arteries. Thank you. Perfect. So there's an increase in pressure in the pulmonary veins, right? So you can't take these challenges and just go all the way around and go, done, right? You cannot do that. It's a closed system where every compartment before it will affect the compartment after it. Okay, so indeed, we could work our way around and that logic is sound, but we're missing a piece. We're missing the effect of this compartment on that one. Flow across the pulmonary system based on the pulmonary venous pressure, or pulmonary venous pressure has just gone up. So flow moving from this compartment to this compartment should now be dropped. So because of this argument, we should expect to see an increase in volume and an increase in pressure. So if we work our way around this way, let me just number where we talked. 1, 2, 3, and then we talked about here, and then we talked about here. Indeed, as we worked our way around this way. But then the backup, quote, the backlog, I think that was a word that we used the other day, a backlog of flow, of volume, will now start to affect the compartment before it. And this argument would argue I should have less movement of volume from here to here because I increased P2. So the volume should be here. I should get an increase in volume and an increase in pressure because I have a decrease in volume through the pulmonary system. Okay, that's what that argument is. So decrease the decrease in volume through the pulmonary system. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We got ourselves to there. So indeed, with these static models, the way it's presented at the moment, it is difficult to predict compartments that are the farthest away from the problem because we start to have sometimes competing influences. okay? I bring the numbers to you today to prove that that's true, that at the end of the day, at this point in time that the data was taken, the pressure was up a little, which means the volume is probably up a little if we looked at that other decimal place. So that both of these are happening, and it looks like both of them are have an equal effect at the moment, because pressure didn't change a whole lot and volume didn't change a whole lot, okay? If we let it go longer, let's say maybe we let this poor soul be in left heart failure for maybe 5 days. Then maybe one would affect the other more. Maybe the effect of 6 would be more than the effect of 5, and we might expect to see an increase in volume and an increase in pressure there. Okay? Or maybe there's another scenario where 5 actually has a greater effect than 6, and we would expect to see a decrease in volume, decrease in pressure. Okay? But we look at the numbers today so that you can actually see that at this point in time, those two arguments would have had, or those two effects would have been equal, and they look like they're kind of canceling each other out. We're filling a compartment less, but we're filling a compartment more. And they look like they're equaling themselves out, okay? On any test, you won't have the numbers. You just need to give me the arguments. And then if you got yourself to a place where I said, tell me what's happening in that compartment, and you brought both influences in, and then you could tell me one or the other, because I can't argue one is right or one is wrong. You would pick one and go. Okay? Okay, so after we get all of our compartments nailed down, I can then jump off of this type of example and say, okay, what's happening with capillary pressure right now? Because now, once you predict every compartment, you have enough information to understand all the influences at the level of the capillary. Because now you know volume in, you know volume out. Okay? So if we were to think about what's happening at the level of the capillary, you can only do this after you've predicted all the 4 compartments. Then you have enough information, okay? So what's happening? Can someone work me through the volume in argument for this capillary bed? Or the volume out argument? Pick which one you like. So who can take me through the volume in argument for this capillary bed? We're trying to predict pressure in the capillary. Or volume out. What are we thinking? Yeah. Increase volume in. Decrease volume in. Okay, so why did you decrease volume in? Because the pressure dropped. What pressure dropped? Systemic arteries. So your mean arterial pressure dropped, essentially, right? That's what that number's telling us, right? Perfect. So I've got a decrease in mean arterial pressure, right? That's going to represent a decrease in volume into the capillaries, decrease in volume in, and a decrease in pressure in. Perfect. Okay, so that would be our volume in argument. What's the volume out argument now? Right, and this was based on flow equaling P1 minus P2 over R. P1 was mean arterial pressure, so that dropped. Flow into decreases, volume in. Okay, yep, volume into decreases. Okay, what's happening on the outflow end? volume out of? What's dictating volume out of? Nothing's dictating volume out of. So volume out is constant. Volume out's constant. Point. Thank you. Decrease the volume out. How did that happen? So we don't ever look at what happened in capillary pressure. We're looking at a snapshot in time, right? We've never said this, then this, then this. We've always said what's going in and what's going out. Okay? So in terms of out, so flow out would equal P1 minus P2 over R. This is P1, right? Don't change it and then change off a change, because we've never done that before, right? P1 would be capillary pressure. P2 would be mean circulatory filling pressure. Yeah. Perfect. Okay, do you see that? This is that venous pressure one. It's tough. Okay? So if I'm going to drop my mean circulatory filling pressure, then my delta P for flow got greater. My drive for pressure, my drive for volume just got greater. So volume out of increases. That means I'm going to drop my volume in because I've got more volume coming out. Volume out of, decrease volume in, decrease pressure in. So our volume in and volume out argument would both argue pressure in the capillaries should drop. And indeed, when we look at the number, we could predict that. Okay? All right, we'll stop there. Have a happy Thanksgiving.